Hi, I'm Jeff Kitchen. This is going to be a fun session. I'm calling it Story Alchemy, Method and Madness. And the idea behind it is that I'm going to start with a raw idea from scratch and just go through the process of trying to turn it into a story because it's just a raw idea. And I spent some time thinking about how I wanted to do this class. And then this morning, before doing it, I put on a movie, Lucy, by Luc Besson. It's about Scarlett Johansson, a party girl who gets tricked by her new boyfriend into delivering something to some criminal organization, some drug, and they capture her, stitch some into her abdomen, and then she gets kicked in the abdomen by somebody else, and the drug gets loose in her, and it creates incredible abilities, godlike power, and we learn more about the mechanics of what she's experiencing because we're seeing a scientist played by Morgan Freeman describe how we only use 10% of our brain and that if we could use more, we would have considerable abilities, control over the autonomic parts of our body, and beyond that, control of other people. And as you use more and more of your brain, you would get into mind over matter. And that we only use 10% of our brains idea has long been proved incorrect, but it makes a fun stepping stone to build science fiction on. And so I watched the beginning of this story and I thought, the raw idea is so interesting. I think I'll do this class out of it. So I'm just taking inspiration from the raw idea that someone could achieve godlike powers. And it's not set in a drug smuggling world or anything like that. I just took a piece of it and oh, that's an interesting thing to play with. This is the raw idea. And it's just one possible way of stating it. Through a hospital mishap or a deliberate lab experiment, someone is given chemicals that radically enhance his brain power to the point of godlike abilities. And I would normally say his or her, but since I'm riffing on Lucy, I'm just trying to go the opposite way. So just to change gears. And that's all there is. There literally isn't anything else. It's just kind of a meditation on, what can we do with that in terms of a possible plot? And I didn't think about it much before sitting down to do this class because I want you to travel along with me as we build it from scratch. It doesn't exist yet. It's just a fun idea to improvise on. There's no conflict in it. There's hardly a protagonist. There's no plot. There's no story. It's just one interesting idea. And it's useful to come at something with practically nothing. Before I started my 2-year training program, I did some study on how people learn. And one of the things that they talk about is that if you're being trained to expertise by someone, you're obviously learning a lot from them and often struggling with that learning process. And it's extremely useful to see the expert flounder. So if you're in a program and your teacher is stumped on something and you see them attack the problem and how they deal with it and how they grapple with it and how they come to grips with it, that's extremely useful because that's the kind of thing that you're trying to do when you're trying to learn how to use the tools and grapple with problems and so on. And one of the quotes that I found in one of the quotes that I found in a book that I read on how people learn is that education is knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. And so here we are with a raw idea that has an interesting set of possibilities. And knowing what to do when you don't know what to do is a useful skill in itself. And at one point, I was talking to my father about that, and he is a retired doctor. And he said, "What does that mean? I don't get it." And I said, "Well, imagine that you're in the emergency room and somebody comes in with something you've never seen before. And you're like, whoa, what is this? And like, you don't know what to do." I said, "But you still know what to do. You just start addressing the problem and ruling certain things out and trying to figure it out." And he was like, "Right, yeah, okay, I totally get what you're talking about now." So it's that kind of thing. So it's really just playing with this and, a hospital mishap or a deliberate lab experiment, possibly with chemicals, induces this. So one of the first things I would do is to go to the 36 dramatic situations. And those are a set of elements with which to brainstorm. They are the 36 dramatic situations are the 36 dramatic situations are an interesting set of elements because they were created in the 1700s by an Italian playwright named Carlo Gozzi. And he said, it may be that you can describe any story quite completely with these 36 basic human emotional conflicts. So these are them here. That's all of them, yes. So there are things like disaster, revolt, remorse, ambition, and they're just elements that stories consist of. So, and the basic idea behind them is that you can describe any story quite completely from one point of view with the 36 dramatic situations. In the same way that you can describe anything in the room that you're in quite completely from one point of view with the periodic table of elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those kind of things. So you can describe the chair you're sitting on quite completely from one point of view, and that it's carbon, hydrogen, magnesium, aluminum. And these are the things that it consists of. And so For story, this is one complete spectrum of raw possibilities for a story. And when Carlo Gozzi said, I think you could describe any story with just these 36 dramatic situations, some people laughed at him, some people tried to come up with more of them and couldn't even come up with as many. And it was endorsed by Goethe and Schiller. And on the strength of those endorsements, it hung around for 120 years or something like that until a French classicist, George Pulte, turned it into a book called The 36 Dramatic Situations. So it's been around a long time, and it's extremely useful. The language is a little bit old world because this language is from a translation. Pulte wrote his book in 1895, and it was translated into English and published in America in 1916. So the language is a little bit old world, but it's not Elizabethan. And once you get familiar with the terminology, it's quite easy. So what we're looking at is which of these 36 dramatic situations are suggest possibilities for this idea. Now, I do a two-step process with the 36 dramatic situations, and I like to know, let's bring this over here. I like to know what elements are active. I like to know what elements are active in a story idea before we even touch it, before we even start playing with it. So, okay, so there's all 36. So, we haven't done anything with this idea. Something happens to someone and they acquire godlike capabilities. So, supplication means asking or begging for help. It's certainly a possibility in this story. Deliverance, rescuing or being rescued. Now, that's interesting because it's inherent in the material. If someone deliberately did this to someone in a laboratory so that they're trying to induce massively enhanced mental capabilities, then there's deliverance like rescue or the seeking of rescue. Or it could be deliverance to the person who has their brain capability enhanced. So deliverance is in there before we even do anything to it. Pursuit is in there if it was done deliberately. Someone needed this person to have enhanced brain power. And if it was done accidentally and they have these great mental powers, then maybe people are in pursuit of them because they need this person with their brain power, or maybe this person with the brain power is in pursuit of something. But at this point, bear in mind that we don't have anything for this plot. It's a piece of a raw idea. Disaster is certainly inherent in that. And I'm skipping over crime pursued by vengeance. If this was a mad scientist who did this to someone, but that's more like in the what if arena where we start to play with these. But these are things that are in the idea before we lay a finger on it. This is what you could call a, what's the word? A spectroscopic analysis. And that's something that astronomers do to stars, where they can evaluate the chemical composition of the star from light years away by seeing the colors that it burn, or whatever they have, they can see, oh, there's more green when we adjust this image in a certain way. That means there's more copper in that star, or there's a lot more magnesium than you normally see in a star like that. And they're able to evaluate the chemical composition of stars from a great distance. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're going, there's madness in this story before we even touch it. Like, the person who did this to the person could be crazy if it's like a mad scientist who, in a lab does this to this person, or it could be obviously that the person to whom it's done goes crazy. Falling prey to cruelty or misfortune is in there by the person to whom it happens. Obtaining. Someone is out to obtain something. Even the person who's trying to do it, if it's intentional, or the person whose brain is enhanced is going to be trying to do something with it. Even if it's to get it out of my brain, I don't want it. That's still trying to get something. Revolt is, it really is inherent in the idea. It's really kind of built into it in a certain way, because if it was like a mad scientist, they're trying to change the order of things, fix something, break something, supersede something. And the person who is given this enhanced mental power may be rebelling against something. So there's revolt is inherent in the idea before we even touch it. And so is daring enterprise. A bold adventure, taking the lead, making things happen, either by the person who deliberately did this or the person whose brain power is enhanced, will probably be involved in daring enterprise. Abduction. It's possible. It's not like automatically inherent in the story. That's more like a what if. What if, somebody was taken there and their brain was enhanced, or those kind of things. So it's not just like sitting there on the surface. That's more of something it's very suggestive. It's just not sitting there. The enigma, the riddle, the mystery would definitely be involved in this, because there's a whole lot of possibility with godlike brain power, and there would be mysteries resolved. There would be mysteries to be resolved. There would be fundamental riddles about life and how you live your life. And if it was done intentionally, then maybe somebody has a riddle they're trying to solve and needs somebody with enhanced brain power. So animosity between kin. It's not sitting there on the surface. Rivalry of kinsmen, I don't know. It's certainly possible for what if, but it's not sitting there before we touch it. Same with murderous adultery. Now, fatal imprudence is really sitting there. In other words, the raw possibility that giving someone godlike brain power might be a catastrophic mistake, or trying to influence somebody with godlike mental power might be a bad mistake. If a mad scientist made this person super smart and then tries to get them to do something, you kind of have a Frankenstein story or something like that. and this person may not want to be manipulated, and that may be fatal either literally or metaphorically for the person who's trying to get them to do it. Involuntary crimes of love, not sitting on the surface, slaying of a kinsman unrecognized isn't really inherent in the raw idea. Self-sacrifice for an ideal, that's more of a what-if possibility. Same with self-sacrifice for kindred, all sacrificed for a passion. That's kind of inherent in there, because if someone did this deliberately, then they may be risking a lot, sacrificing a lot to get this. The person who gets the enhanced brain power might put a lot on the line to achieve something. So it's definitely a what if, but it's also kind of like you can just see it sitting there. Whereas something like this, you'd have to concoct a situation in which that would become an operating factor in the story. Same with the necessity of sacrificing loved ones. It's a fascinating what if, but it's not automatically inherent in the material. Now, rivalry of superior and inferior is definitely inherent in the material, because somebody has godlike mental capabilities now and somebody doesn't. So there's a real who's the smarter one, who's on top, who has the higher status, who's in control. So that's built into this thing. All right. Adultery isn't inherent in the material. Crimes of love isn't. Discovery of the dishonor of a loved one is not built into this idea before we touch it. Obstacles to love, not immediately in there. An enemy loved is intriguing. An enemy loved is falling in love with an enemy, fascination with an enemy, respect for an enemy. And I think that that feels like it could easily be part of this story, because you kind of have, I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. But it seems like it kind of comes with the package. Ambition. Yeah, ambition is definitely active in the story before we even touch it. Because if this was done intentionally, then there's an intentional ambition, and the person with the godlike capabilities would presumably have a lot of ambition. Conflict with a god is built into this story. And what that means is going up against a great power. So that's obviously the person who has the godlike capabilities is like a god. So anyone who is in conflict with this person is in conflict with a person of immense power, great capabilities. And the person who has been given these godlike capabilities might be up against someone who's extremely smart, extremely cunning. Anytime you're up against a great power, even if it's the neighborhood kids versus the bully, that's conflict with a god. You're up against a great power. The less literally you take these situations, the more actual use you can make out of them. So you want to look at them with the mind of a poet, look at them metaphorically. Mistaken jealousy certainly fits in a what if, but it's not necessarily like automatically jumping off the page at me. Erroneous judgment is definitely built into that, and it kind of goes along with fatal imprudence. Like, is this like a wise thing to do, or is it a disastrous thing to do? And even the person with godlike capabilities might make bad choices, major mistakes, those kind of things. Remorse, interesting to look at and think about. And remorse can be activated. The element of remorse can be active in a story obviously by someone feeling remorse for a deed, or showing remorse, or even someone who has no remorse can activate that situation. Recovery of a lost one. It's interesting. It's a great what if, but I don't feel like it's automatically in this before we even touch it. And loss of loved ones. Again, it's a great what if, but I don't see it built into this. So let me just consolidate this list a little bit. Okay. So some of these will prove useful. These are ones that I see are active in the story before we even touch it. So let's focus on these for a minute more. All right, so let's get a look at these and see what we got. And so one of the things that I do with these is to kind of cluster them. If you picture each one of these like a molecule, if you picture each one of these like an atom, then I like to cluster them together into a kind of a molecule. Um, so I'm just looking at some aspects of this story. There's elements of kind of like a science fiction type hubris of like being too ambitious and creating disaster and rebelling against the way things are and trying to change reality and getting in over our heads. And so it's an interesting thing to look at. And it's not like a ready-made plot falls off a truck already built here. These are just elements with which to create a possible plot. We don't even have a story at this point. It's just part of a raw idea. But it's interesting to think about, like, what kind of story could you make out of someone having godlike capabilities? And there's been many stories like this. But it's interesting to come at it fresh and to come at it with nothing, just an inkling of something, and to see what we can make out of it. And part of that process is that I don't want to just rush into it. I don't want to just emulate the same type of stories that have been done before. I don't want to just fall into the rut of how Frankenstein was written, or all these different stories that are often, what's the word? a cautionary parable of like Icarus, like don't try to fly too close to the sun. Don't be too ambitious. Don't try to become godlike because that will always blow up in your face. That to me is just small-minded, superstitious, stay in your place type stories that were invented over the centuries by kings who don't want people to have power. So they create fables about how power is bad. So they create fables about how power is bad. Now we're definitely dealing with some of those elements here, but that doesn't mean that's the way the story's going to go. That's just one possible direction for it. There's hundreds of possible stories in this raw idea. What we're doing is we're just saying, okay, these are a handful of elements that could be at the nucleus of this potential story. These two obviously sort of cluster together in certain ways. And, you know, they kind of cluster together with these. And this. There's also the enigma, the riddle, the mystery, rebelling against limits in our brain power and trying to obtain substantial answers and being brave and trying things and getting out there, being in pursuit of something, trying to save things. And enemy love, I think, really is more like a potentially a what if. It kind of is inherent in the story, but it's not just like this. You can just see if someone has godlike powers that there's going to be rivalry of superior and inferior. This this has that in it, but it may be more of a what if. But very quickly, we're going to be dealing with the what ifs as well. These are just some things that jumped out at me that seemed like uh, interesting possibilities for the story. For instance, we could make a molecule out of, or it's like mind mapping, where you put this in the middle and you put some of the other things around it, like ambition, conflict with a god, pursuit, pursuit, daring enterprise, deliverance, seeking rescue, the enigma, the riddle that must be solved, obtaining something that has to be obtained, rebelling against the way things are. So that's another possible constellation of possibilities to play with. Risking a lot for something, going out on a limb, needing to solve something, wanting to advance something, needing a rescue, a bold adventure, bold enterprise. So these are just raw possibilities to contemplate. All right. So let's play some what if now. So this obviously is a distinct function of the 36 dramatic situations. Which of them are in a story before you even touch it? So we've gone through and thought about these a little bit. There's some interesting possibilities. There's a whole lot of directions to go in. All we really have is this at this point. So let's make a copy of these. We'll set it right over here. Okay, so we're just making a copy of that and leaving that over there because we're going to go do some finger painting with these over here. Just kind of play around with them. So So now let's play what if with these. So in terms of the raw idea, if there's a hospital mishap, and this sounds a lot like an origin story of a superhero or something, like Spider-Man got bitten by a radioactive spider. So a hospital mishap means that like somebody accidentally got way too much of something. In Luc Besson's movie Lucy, she is used as a drug mule, and they sew this drug inside her, and they said that it is a chemical that the mother naturally releases in for the fetus to energize the rapid growth process, something like that. So it's some kind of hormone or chemical or something. And they made a synthetic of that so that if someone is being administered some of this, and like there's an earthquake or a power outage, now presumably a hospital has backup generators and they're going to make it so that their equipment doesn't majorly malfunction just from the power getting turned off. That should be seamless. So it might be more like something like an earthquake or fire in the operating room, or a doctor dies of a heart attack, or I don't know, just something where that which is being administered accidentally they get like 10 times as much, and that changes them. Or if it's a deliberate lab experiment where either a mad scientist is trying to put this kind of brain power into someone who's might be a lab rat, or is maybe trying to save a loved one from, a brain tumor or something like that, or the person's dying anyway, so they're going to give it a try because they're desperate to keep this person around. So it could either be with good intent or evil intent, but it's deliberate. We're still dealing with, okay, they get whatever this thing is, and it massively enhances their mental capabilities to the point of godlike abilities. And in Lucy, she got more and more powerful. She went from using 10% of her brain to 20% of her brain to 30, 40, got up to 100. And as she got more and more power, she acquired telekinesis and she got telepathy, telekinesis, mental time travel, and she gets into mind over matter, but she can control electronic devices and a lot of things like that. So it's rich with possibility. And that's all I really started with, is just what kind of a story could we make out of that? And in part because I was planning to do this exercise and I wanted an idea that was intriguing, open-ended, fun to play with, dynamic, and well, it's certainly been done plenty of times. It hasn't been done to death. We're not like, oh God, another one of these. Like you could say that like serial killer stories have pretty much been done to death. There's, thousands of them. Whereas this one is still breaking in a certain way, especially as science is coming up with new things constantly these days, which moves the starting point for science fiction further and further ahead. Because the stuff that they're figuring out for real now in science is the stuff that like Philip K. Dick played with as possibilities 40, 50 years ago. So the goal line keeps moving. And I see these things constantly on the internet, and they're fascinating. They're figuring out how memories are formed, how good memories are sorted from bad memories, how and what's interesting is that the human brain is so studied, and I've been watching some of the research that comes out on a regular basis, and it's amazing. And I went and looked up a little bit more of it for here because the research is not only constantly opening up, but it's doing major and minor breakthroughs all the time. And what I found was that we still know less about the human brain than we do know. In other words, the stack of what we know is still smaller than the stack of what we don't know. And most of what we know for sure about the brain has been figured out in the last 15 years. Now, imagine that. We've been studying the brain for a long, long time. And in the last 15 years, like since the year, what is that, 2008, something like that? That's when we figured out most of it. So it's an arena that, to tell a story like this and to create a story like this, it really helps to be working with the most current stuff, because the stuff that Philip K. Dick couldn't have imagined is now established fact. So we're building on that. So in a quick search of the internet, I found this one article plus a thing on 92 facts about the human brain, which I read, but it was too complicated to put down here, but you can go look it up. But this is something that we've known. I've always heard this, that the 3-pound human brain is the most complex piece of organized matter in the known universe. So on this one website, neurotrackerx.com, I found this article, 7 of the most exciting neuroscience discoveries in 2021. And this is interesting because of what they're able to do with the brain. It's and what they're discovering about it. It's pretty astonishing. Deep brain stimulation to treat depressive symptoms, electrodes in the brain to deliver currents to alter brain activity. And these are like, this is not electroshock therapy. This is like mild current, I believe. But they're actually seeing which part of the brain does what. And with the advent of, what do you call that? CAT scan and those kind of things, they can put somebody in there and watch them while they learn a language and see which parts of their brain are active. And I think those kind of machines have really helped a lot. So this type of automatic on-demand therapy is impressive because its functional responses are unique to both the patient's brain and the neural circuit causing the illness. So they're getting rid of depression, and it works. So it's amazing. Let's see what else we have here. Human mini brains developed with complex neural activity. So they're growing mini brains from a person's stem cells from a person's skin or blood that can morph into any type of cell. And they are turning it into brains, apparently, brain cells. But in one of the 92 facts about the brain, they said that a grain of sand, a piece of brain the size of a grain of sand, can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like 1 billion neurons and 100,000 blanking on it. So delete that, edit that out. Okay. So they're building a mini brain and able to take small like cells from somebody's brain who's having seizures and replicate a mini brain that has the same symptoms, so they can observe the patterns of electrical activity, and they can test drugs and treatments on these mini brains. Neurograins used to develop next generation brain-computer interface. Brain-computer interface. A wireless computer so small it can be missed by the human eye. Neurograin size of a grain of salt, developed to track and monitor brain activity. Able to record electrical activity from nearby neurons and transmit their data wirelessly. Develop a new type of brain-computer interface where a network of mini sensors can collectively track meaningful aspects of brain activity. And this is like Neuromancer. This is, what's his name, who wrote Ender's Game? This is like Neuromancer from Orson Scott Card, who wrote Ender's Game, where they were putting chips into people's brains. They called it wetware. And, you know, this was written in 1980 or something. So this is leagues beyond what the best science fiction brains were coming up with years ago is now real. And so we can take off from here. We have a new starting point. So they're getting to the point where by recording brain signals, they're able to convert brain waves into useful real-world actions without any physical effort. And that's huge. You can think it, and it moves a mouse. And they have, one of the things I saw recently was they grew a brain in a petri dish and it could play Pong. They had taught it to play Pong. These are the types of things I'm seeing in the internet day to day. Beyond human hearing. Humans can only perceive a relatively small spectrum of sound waves, right? New method utilizing sophisticated technology pioneered by scientists at Aalto University to give humans bat-level hearing, to hear frequencies well beyond 20,000 megahertz, but to tell where they're coming from and how far away they're coming from. That's echolocation. So they're getting super hearing. AI independently learns to smell in the same way that humans do. Artificial neural networks can now learn how to smell in just a few minutes, actually mimicking the olfactory circuits in mammalian brains. This is profound because the algorithm put to work had no knowledge of the millions of years of evolution required to develop smell biologically. See, like, this is gold for a science fiction writer. AI can replicate millions of years of evolution. It's pretty astonishing. And restoring functional vision for completely blind people. I've been hearing about this for years. A new type of microelectrode array has been used to create a form of artificial vision via visual prosthesis. They built a device to record and stimulate neuronal activity in the visual cortex. Implanted within the eye, the array receives visual information through glasses. Visual information through glasses containing a small video camera and the data processed by specialized software. The device then activates retinal neurons to produce phosphenes as if they were receiving points of light, in turn allowing basic images of lines and shapes to be perceived by the mind. And it was done with someone who was completely blind. And I had a fascinating conversation with a blind massage person. He was giving me a massage and he was completely blind. And we got talking about how they were having, and this was 25 years ago, about how they were having, how they could put an image into the visual cortex of a blind person so you could see dim things out of focus, but you could see there was a thing there, a stop sign or a person or a shape. And it was very rudimentary, but we got talking about it. And, if they can use a machine to put an image into your head, then I said, I'm a science fiction person. So that means if they can do that, they can also play a movie in your head. You could watch Blade Runner only in your visual cortex. And you could also give people dreams. So the places you can go, the reason I'm showing you this stuff is that we are working with someone who has had their brain capacity expanded or stimulated or something to a godlike capacity. And so this kind of thing is, you get real traction on ways to do that or what that could look like. And here I just saw this recently. They had a bunch of people walking who had permanent spinal cord severing or something like that. Repair tissue in severe spinal cord injuries and successfully reverse paralysis. Get neuron molecules or something to wiggle their way into normally impossible to reach cellular receptors in order to prompt them to get into gear repairing nerve tissues. These seemingly magic molecules work by setting off cascading signals, triggering axons to regenerate and helping neurons to survive after injury by encouraging a variety of new cells to be born. This in turn supports the regrowth of lost blood vessels necessary for cellular healing. So this is great stuff for science fiction writing, first-rate research. And this is just dipping my toe in the ocean. I went to one site, found this, brought it over here. Neuroprosthesis converts thoughts into sentences in severely paralyzed patient. A new kind of speech neuroprosthesis for patients with paralyses that prevent them from speaking. The method was demonstrated successfully on a man with a severely damaged brainstem causing whole body paralysis. Somewhat remarkably, it works by detecting speech-related brain signals that control the vocal cords. When we speak, the vocal cords require complex motor function instructions in order to articulate the wide variety of sounds we use when conversing. Even when unable to move, these signals can still get sent from the brain. Developed a method for real-time decoding of instructions to vocal muscles into words. So it's just a quick look at one small thing, one small aspect of this that can help trigger possibilities. And it's basically the idea that research and brainstorming go together well. When you have first-class research, which is called material to a writer, you find your material and you work with it, and this stuff will trigger ideas. And the 36 trigger ideas. And as you begin to see possibilities in here, your research will also trigger possibilities, and you can get this to trigger this, and you get a kind of a feedback loop. And obviously, you know, your imagination is going off, just pure storytelling. So let's go look at these a little more now. And notice how just in exploring this idea, there's really not even a story yet. There's just one element for a story, but that element itself is interesting, fascinating, suggestive, gives us something to bite into, something to play with, something to think about. There's no villain. We don't know who this person is that this happens to. We don't know how it happened. We don't know why it happened. We don't know what world it's in. It's loaded with possibilities. So let's see which of these are interesting. Like disaster is interesting. It's suggestive. There's a lot of possibilities in that. And it goes along with erroneous judgment and fatal imprudence, doing the wrong thing, guessing wrong, jumping into something that doesn't work. The enigma, the riddle, that's interesting. Ambition in this type of situation is potent. Daring enterprise. Deliverance, rescuing or being rescued, trying to rescue something. Same thing here, trying to get something specific. Revolt, even going against death, or, you know, brain death or something like that. Just moving this around so it fits better. Falling prey to cruelty or misfortune is certainly intriguing. Conflict with a god is potent because it suggests that there's at least one great power here. And it could be the maker, it could be the one who did this. It doesn't have to be the one to whom it was done. In other words, if there's a mad scientist and there's a subject of the experiment, the mad scientist may be holding all the cards, and the subject of this experiment may be the underling. So you look at rivalry of superior and inferior, like who's on top, who has the higher status, who holds the cards, who's running things. And the same thing here. And this could apply to that because the mad scientist might fall in love with his or her subject, or the slave might fall in love with the master, or think they're falling in love with the master, or be commanded to fall in love with the master. So an enemy loved is interesting in that way. And conflict with a god, because if this person has had their brain power radically enhanced, and yet we're playing with the possibility that the mad scientist is the one who's in charge, but how long is it going to stay that way if this person is either acquiring more and more power or learning how to use the power that he or she has, or rebelling? In other words, does a mad scientist here, let's start to collect some of these ideas over here. And, maybe slave is a better word. You deal with this in Blade Runner, because what was interesting in Blade Runner is the motto of the Tyrell Corporation was more human than human. And this is something that I'm not sure if everybody gets. It's what they call the opening crawl, where the words go down the page. It says, early in the 21st century, the Tyrell Corporation advanced robot evolution into the Nexus phase. And they said it was That's a remarkable statement because of this right here is extraordinary. Because when you see the when Chief Inspector Bryant is telling Deckard that he has to go find these replicants and kill them, he explains what they are. And you see each of them with their heads spinning around. You see Roy Batty in like a nylon stocking, and Chris and Zora, Leon. And in writing down below, it goes by quickly, but it says that Roy Batty is a physical type A, mental type A. And Leon is a physical type B, mental type B, maybe even mental type C. And Zora is physical A, mental B, Pris is physical A, mental B. And therefore, that means that I don't remember if Leon was a type C mentality or a type B, but Leon is at least equal in intelligence to the genetic engineers who created him, which not only means that Roy Batty is smarter than them, which is demonstrated in the movie, but that Leon is at least equal in intelligence to the genetic engineers at Tyrell Corporation who built these creatures. And if you see him in his Voight-Kampff test at the beginning of the movie, when Holden asks 15 questions, Leon asks 17 questions. What desert? Why would I be there? He's constantly asking questions. He's smart. He may seem like a knuckle dragger, but his brain is good. So it's interesting that the Tyrell Corporation has created a species that is superior to them, and therefore brings on their destruction. It's Tyrell's hubris, his pride. He can't stop. He's got to make it better and better and better. So that the slave is superior to the master. So it's interesting. It's an interesting thing to contemplate when you're looking at who's the superior and who's the inferior, and who's the god, and who's the more powerful deity, and revolt against one's assigned job, and even fascination with an enemy, falling in love with an enemy, respect for an enemy. Madness goes right along with this of like, who is the superior? There's a real madness to it, or a madness resulting. It's tricky, it's complicated, it's interesting, it's suggestive. So crime pursued by vengeance can be active in a story like this. The, 'cause, 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 ' what crime, what kind of vengeance. And remember, it's a matter of perception, because what one person can see as totally normal, to somebody else, they see a crime. Even something like, with vegetarians, like one person would see, oh, this cow got killed so I could have a steak. Like, that's totally normal. Whereas, like, a militant, vegan or something like that can see that as a absolute crime, and it's murder. And it's so it's very much what the crime is can be rooted in perception. And the mad scientist can feel like there's been a major crime committed against him or her, and is seeking vengeance and is pursuing it with a vengeance. Vengeance taken for kindred upon kindred. So let's tag this one. I'm just going to make all these the same color at this point, because I don't think the distinctions are too subtle. And so I'm just going to tag the ones that are offering interesting possibilities for us. And definitely, making bad choices absolutely goes along in a story like this. In pursuit of something, being pursued by it, all sacrifice for a passion. Asking or begging for help is interesting, especially in someone with godlike capabilities. They're going to be asked for things. And yet, if the slave is the one with godlike abilities and the mad scientist is the one with the power, then the slave might be asking or begging for help. And it's interesting. It's an interesting aspect of the story, because who is the master, and how much a matter of perception is that? For instance, there's a famous example that's used in psychology where circus elephants, when they're young, are restrained by a chain and a heavy steel stake driven into the ground, and they get used to it. So the elephant that grew up on a chain and a steel stake hammered to the ground, once it's grown up with that and is used to it, they just tie a piece of clothesline to it and hammer a little piece of wood in the ground, and it gets to the end of the string and it stops trying. It knows it can't get away. It's convinced. And so it's a classic illustration in psychology of someone being restrained by things that have no real power over them. And so if the slave has godlike abilities, but is obedient to the mad scientist and believes that the mad scientist is the superior one, then it kowtows to the mad scientist. It might use its godlike mind against other people, but it has bought the the mythology that the mad scientist has laid down. And therefore, revolt becomes very powerful in this type of story, because if the slave is going to be awakened or fight for its freedom, where you then have conflict with a god, and the enemy love is starting to break down, then you have a dynamic story of someone realizing their full power and starting to break out, or trying to. But you see that in extremely repressive regimes, where people who have grown up with a deep understanding that the state has all the power and they have none, it's very, very hard to break them free of that. They've been so thoroughly programmed that they're literally incapable of forming those thoughts. It's a really fascinating arena. There's a whole science behind that. And so you can see how, even without a story here, we have interesting elements to play with and some fascinating research, both like psychologically and, in things that are out there of, and this is probably 1/1000th of what's out there that's coming out new every day. Like this, where is it? This here. This is from 2021, so maybe the end of 2021, presumably they wrote this. And here we are, it's now November of 2022. So this is a year old, and yet last week I saw that they had 9 people who had been paralyzed who are now walking because they repaired. So it's like, it's this same technology, but a year later, where it's not just mice. Now it's people. So this stuff is constantly changing. And it's interesting because with global warming being so bad, they're having incredible breakthroughs in science. And right as all that is flowering more and more, maybe the whole planet is going down the tubes. It's ironic and sad and tragic and weird. I also did a little bit I went into the thesaurus to look at words that talked about amplifying, making better, like what happens to this person with their brain. So we have evolve, breakthrough, upgrade, advance, boost, flower, like the flowering of something great, jump, like a quantum leap or something, growth, improve, augment, heighten, amplify, enhance, enrich, multiply, magnify, intensify, deepen, transform, empower. So that was just a quick look. I'm always interested in the language of these things because it's so easy to say it the same way every time. So it's interesting to find out what are some other words that say the same thing. So you have more vocabulary with which to work. You're not stuck using the same 3 or 4 words, and those 3 or 4 words may not be the best words anyway. And falling prey to cruelty or misfortune, absolutely, like from the point of view of the slave, like awakening to the fact that they live in a test tube, or I don't know what, live in a laboratory, or they're just a slave, or they could be treated horribly. It depends on, the mental state of the master. Animosity between kin is certainly going on, could certainly be happening between a slave and a mad scientist. So hatred between kin could certainly be in there. There could certainly be rivalry between them, because that goes back to rivalry of superior and inferior, and rivalry of superior and inferior, and conflict with a god. So rivalry of kinsmen, and they don't have to literally be kin. It's metaphoric. It's you and the people you're at work with. There's a kinship there. So anywhere in which there is a real kinship or perceived kinship, you can have rivalry of kin. And vengeance taken for kindred upon kindred. That's like you're getting even upon your dad for beating up your mom, for your mom upon your dad, for kindred upon kindred. So it's infighting. And it can definitely happen. It's interesting. It's a possibility. It depends on, are there other slaves? What does this situation look like? What is the goal? What is the objective of the mad scientist? What is his or her ambition? A lot of raw possibilities. Slaying of a kinsman unrecognized is interesting, because that means that someone is being slain without being recognized. And it could be like you accidentally shooting your cousin, like, why were you climbing in through my window in the middle of the night, you idiot? I got a gun. Or it can be like a little girl's waiting for her dad to come home, and he comes home drunk and he's mean to her, and she feels slain and unrecognized, like, I'm his little darling. So there's broad metaphoric. And so, like, a slave who is in love with the master but feels slain and unrecognized and used and thrown away, like Rachel, like Tyrell says about Rachel in Blade Runner. Rachel is an experiment, nothing more. So the slave can be awakening to the ways in which he or she is just being used and is not loved and is not cared for and is just a tool. So it's interesting. It's suggestive. I'm not seeing much here or here at first glance. Self-sacrifice for an ideal. That's interesting. It's intriguing. It's suggestive. What kind of ideal? What for? What is the, soldiers lose their life to fight for their country, for their people, for their fellow soldiers. They have a strong ideal, and they're not necessarily wanting to sacrifice themselves, but they put themselves in harm's way, and it happens. And, it's the same thing for, like, a parent waking up at 4 a.m. to go make money for their family. They self-sacrifice for kindred. They're dying for a couple more hours of sleep, but they're on the train going to work. So there's all degrees of intensity for all these. And all different colorations and all that. There's many different ways you can self-sacrifice for kindred or self-sacrifice for an ideal. So both of these are interesting and suggestive. Adultery, I don't know. Obviously, literally adultery means you're cheating on somebody. But, if you're in the mafia and you start talking to the FBI, you're violating the contract. You're going outside of the agreement. So metaphorically, adultery could work in this. Probably swing back to that. Crimes of love can be there in the way in which the mad scientist treats the slave, like, I thought you loved me, but you're just using me. So that's interesting. And the discovery of the dishonor of a loved one, if the slave can gradually awaken to the way in which the mad scientist is a monster and take action against it, then you have revolt. It's the elephant realizing it can just rip that 2x2 out of the ground and do whatever it wants. Obstacles to love is interesting. And it goes along with enemy love. And you can see that what we're doing is we are kind of circling around this one idea that we've got a master and a slave, and the master created the slave for its brain power, and they're in a master-slave relationship. And yet there is perceived love and perceived connection, and they're working together, they care about each other, something like that, but it's not real, and the slave is beginning to notice that. And that's just one possible direction for this story to go. We're really, everything's wide open at this point, but we're just, as we keep going around with the mad scientist and the slave, we've kind of been developing this one possible direction for the story. And that's good, that's useful. Mistaken jealousy, interesting, suggestive. The slave could perceive that normal people have it great. They say the man with the toothache thinks that everybody else in the world who doesn't have a toothache is perfectly happy. So the person who is the slave in here could have wildly mistaken ideas about how the rest of the world is and how it operates and what they have and don't have. Remorse. Now, that would seem to suggest at first glance that the mad scientist might develop remorse. And they might. Or maybe they have it sometimes and then they revert back to the harsh master. This would also be active if the mad scientist has utterly no remorse and is really a brutal monster. Or can the creature with godlike abilities develop some remorse, some humanity, some ability to see beyond his or her program. Recovery of a lost one. Interesting. That suggests that someone has been lost, which is interesting. For instance, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of playing with this idea is that if someone is deliberately trying to save someone from like a brain tumor or something like that, and it ends up creating this creature with godlike abilities, enhanced mental capacity, something like that, in an attempt to save someone who was dying or going downhill or that kind of thing. And there's certainly many other options for that. But it also talks about this connection, this, this intimacy and this betrayal and this perception of who's in charge and who's the more powerful. So talking about kind of an aberrated relationship, an unhealthy relationship with someone who is only using the slave. And loss of loved ones would be active for that reason, or in various ways, or just loss of loved ones in general is interesting and suggestive. It could even be, the mad scientist losing the slave as the slave rebels, and the mad scientist is left with no slave with which he or she is in love. And you can see out of like a whole broad area of possibilities, we're just kind of exploring one little corner of that. Abduction. So there is literal abduction where you actually kidnap someone, but there is also psychic abduction where you kind of steal their soul or take them over or take away their power of choice. A cult-like stealing of the person's free will. Here we have the necessity of sacrificing loved ones, which I didn't see lurking down there. And that's interesting because it goes along with an enemy loved and all this aberrated relationship, this unhealthy love affair. Like if the mad scientist is using the slave's enhanced brain power to achieve certain things, but that person is still remaining a slave, and yet they love this person, so it's necessary to keep using the person you love as a slave for their enhanced brain power. So, and the slave may end up killing the master to get free and yet still love the master. And so we didn't use these three, but what's interesting is that we are circling around this kind of warped love story. And even if it's not like love, like lovers, it could still be like a sense of duty and a sense of connection and a sense of bonding and wanting to protect somebody, and the warped mentality that it takes to be in love with the person that hurts you and uses you. And you see that all the time in dysfunctional relationships. If a woman's being beaten by a man, you give her a way out. In many instances, she won't take it, or she'll end up back with the guy. It's really unhealthy, and there's a lot of that in the real world. That really cripples a lot of people. And so all of that to say that with all of these other situations, we're at this point, we're using 33 of the 36, each in different ways. But because we are talking, like I said, we are discussing one little corner of a whole bunch of options in a story like this, but we're really exploring this one little corner, and that's good. So you could see how a slave rebelling against its master could be perceived as adultery. There even could be literal adultery. And therefore, there could also be murderous adultery, where somebody wants to shoot the other one. And there can be involuntary crimes of love, where they're not meaning to be that bad or to do things, but they're just happening. That's like unintentional, but it's still happening. So we ended up with all 36, mostly because an enemy love got our brain going, that would be an interesting dynamic, and we played with it. So all we've really done so far is start out with the raw idea, see which of the 36 jumped out at us, which was these, before we even touched the idea. These were all active in the story idea without playing what if at all. We played with the 36. We played with one possible story. We looked at just a small cross-section of research in this arena that can be really stimulating and suggest a lot of ideas. Not just these, but there's a whole lot more. So we'll keep going with this story, but I'm going to knock off here. But this is a good time for you to dig into some of the research, see what's out there, see what scientific breakthroughs, and we're not trying to do one-to-one reality. This is hardcore science fiction. So, read an article about how they can wildly enhance the brain. They can create hearing much better than humans can. AIs can emulate what we do quickly and simply. They're interfacing with the brain and a computer. All of these things can trigger a whole bunch of dynamic possibilities for this story. And the reason that I call this lesson Story Alchemy is that we're conjuring a story out of a raw idea. And method and madness, we have a method, but you also want to go off the deep end and come up with a story that knocks people for a loop. You don't want to just write the same old story that everybody's written. Don't get stuck in that rut. Don't get stuck in your own rut. Violate the expectations of the audience. Shake up the possibilities. Take your time, dig deep. Most people say that every story has been told, and part of me absolutely agrees with that, and part of me that just puts me in a blind fury, because I refuse to think that I can't come up with something here that nobody's ever seen before. So go off the deep end, get into chaos, get yourself in trouble, play hardball, get in over your head. Okay, so we'll do some more of this. We'll come back to it. Do some work on this. It's a very rich, raw idea with a lot of possibilities. And the research that's available now, just online, is absolutely extraordinary. Okay, we'll come back to this.